Thank you everyone for joining. My name's Lena Agajanian, and I'm co-hosting this webinar along with my colleague, Les Levido. So welcome everyone to this webinar on Palestine's history. Why is it so contentious? Regretfully, I must share that one of our speakers, Professor Ilan Pape, is now unable to join us. However, we're delighted to have two esteemed speakers with us today, Dr. Ghada Karmi and Professor Haim Reshid Sabner. I hope you'll join me in extending them a very warm welcome. Following some introductory comments from myself and Les, Ghada and Haim will each present, and then we will allow time for your questions. Please pop your questions in the Q&A tab, selecting Ask a Question from the drop-down list. I'd like to highlight our code of conduct, which my colleague will paste into the chat. Please could we ask everyone to use respectful and tolerant language. We will not accept any form of discrimination or harassment, and we encourage anyone who has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment during this webinar to alert us. This webinar is organised by the Open University Ceasefire in Gaza Group, a group which was initiated following a 15-minute walkout in mid-November to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The group continued meeting on a weekly basis to express how we felt in relation to current events in the Palestinian territories in Israel. We soon formed a steering committee to plan our activities, which include a series of webinars. Our first webinar had the title, The Israel-Palestine Issue Comes to the Open University, How to Facilitate Free Debate. So Carlos will put the link to that recording in the chat. The talks emphasised threats to free speech and means to protect this, especially in universities. It was felt that one issue that needed free speech and debate was the history of Palestine, which is often evaded or sanitised in public history and definitely in the media. Hence this second webinar on Palestine's history. Why is it so contentious? One pivotal point in modern Palestinian history is what Palestinians call the Nakba, which means catastrophe in Arabic, referring to the mass displacement and dispossession of Palestinians in 1948 and culminating in the newly declared State of Israel. To share my family's story of the Nakba, which I think has certain similarities to Ghada's story, which you'll hear later. My father was born in Haifa, Palestine. In 1948, he was sent as a young boy to Lebanon, where he had family. He travelled by taxi as it was only an hour's drive away, thinking that it was just like their yearly holidays in Lebanon. His mother then had to follow by boat, since by that point all of the roads were closed due to the conflict, and his father joined them a bit later once he had wrapped up some work. He was a government employee working at the port of Haifa. They left their house just as it was, thinking it would be temporary, not realizing that they would not be able to return. My father's family were extremely lucky in that they were able to gain Lebanese citizenship. At the time, the Lebanese government was offering citizenship to Palestinian Christians. This wasn't the case for the majority of those fleeing Palestine in 1948 and beyond, many of whom became refugees in their host countries with very limited rights. Over 75 years on, there are now 5 million Palestinian refugees throughout the Middle East, according to the UN, most of whom are now second or third generation. Palestinians who were internally displaced during the Nakba moved to the Gaza Strip, and those who remained in eastern Jerusalem and what is now referred to as the West Bank have suffered years of stifling and oppressive occupation and the ongoing threat of displacement and dispossession. The Nakba is a deeply traumatic event in the history of Palestine, and it continues to shape the Palestinian struggle for justice and for their right to return to their homeland. For me, the history of my family isn't something I've always felt comfortable or able to talk about freely. Firstly, there's so much stigma associated with being Palestinian. And secondly, the history of Palestine isn't something that people know very much about. It's considered to be too sensitive or too complicated to talk about. Ghada Karmi's memoir, In Search of Fatima, was one of the first to document the psychological impact of exile faced by a survivor of the Nakba. Reading it as a young adult helped me understand more how the Nakba may have impacted my father, uncles, and grandparents, but I also identified with Ghada's struggle of feeling like an outsider and as though she didn't belong when she moved to the UK, knowing that she couldn't return to live in her homeland. Thank you. I'll now pass on to Les.
Thanks, Lena. Our webinar publicity indicated a current reason why Palestine's history is so contentious. After the Saturday, 7th October last year, Israel claimed it was exercising its right of self-defense in response to an unprovoked attack. Along those lines, many Western commentaries implied that the conflict had just begun then, or that Hamas had broken a truce. As the UK's Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, said, quote, "These events started on Saturday," meaning the 7th of October. When UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres said that the Hamas attacks did not happen in a vacuum, he was widely denounced for justifying them. Indeed, since its establishment, Israel has portrayed its violence as necessary to counter existential threats. This dominant narrative plays the role of psychological warfare, intimidating and demonizing any dissent. Either the history becomes irrelevant, or else it casts Israel as a perpetual victim, moreover, as a victim of anti-Semitism. This narrative conflates a settler colonial apartheid regime with world Jewry. The narrative inverts the historical roles of the settler colonial aggressor and its colonized victim. This is a familiar colonial and neo-colonial trope, or familiar at least in post-colonial studies, and now becoming familiar through the Palestine Solidarity movement. Such critical perspectives have been popularized through efforts to decolonize the curriculum. Many universities espouse this agenda in general terms, but the Israel-Palestine issue often remains an academic exception, just as it generally remains a political exception, at least within North America and Europe. There, the dominant pro-Israel narrative is internalized throughout mainstream institutions. So counter-narratives are necessary to force a debate. For this webinar, our publicity posed the following questions. Beyond clichés about the cycle of violence, what are its rival narratives? What started the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict? What should it be called? How does academia often evade, trivialize, or sanitize this history? How can the contentious history be highlighted within academia and beyond? Now to the speakers.
Okay, thank you, Les. So I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Ghada Karmi. Ghada was born in Jerusalem and was forced to leave her home during the Nakba of 1948. Her family moved to England, where she grew up and was educated. Ghada trained as a doctor and established the first British Palestinian medical charity in 1972. She also held a number of research appointments on Middle Eastern politics and culture at the School of Oriental and African Studies and in the universities of Durham, Leeds, and Exeter. Ghada has authored a number of books, including the best-selling memoir I mentioned earlier, In Search of Fatima, and most recently, One State, the Only Democratic Future for Palestine-Israel. Ghada, over to you.
Okay, I think you know that the this very contentious history, as it is described, could have been very much simpler if it had not been for the fact that the setting up of the state of Israel in somebody else's country was not such a really outrageous enterprise. And if it had not been also for the fact that the Holocaust played a very large part in supporting this enterprise on the basis that the Jews had suffered in Europe and were deserved recompense. So with these two factors muddying the waters, the story became very complicated, needlessly so, because in fact, the cliché, as we were told in the introduction, the cliché of cycles of violence and almost aiming to create a picture of equivalence on both sides, the Israeli side and the Palestinian side somehow are roughly equivalent, and hence you have a cycle of violence, and hence you have this conflict. All this is entirely wrong, because the two sides are not equivalent in any sense at all. And secondly, it is not a conflict, because a conflict is something that happens between two equal parties. This is not the case in Israel-Palestine. The true situation, which is obfuscated by this kind of language and the way the whole subject is taught within academia and the way it is projected in the media and in public discourse, the whole issue is presented not as it really is, not the truth, but something entirely different. What is the truth? Well, as we've heard already, the truth is that Israel is a settler colony. It is a colony created and sustained by Western powers. There are various motives for doing this, which we don't need to go into, but these are very powerful factors in A, the creation of the State of Israel, and B, its maintenance to this moment. That is the true picture. The settler colony was set up in the country of another people, the Palestinians, and to their detriment. The settler colony led and could not indeed have been established at all without the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population of Palestine, and I'm one of them. So in reality, what we have here is a colonial situation. I mean, would anybody describe the French in Algeria, that the revolution, that the Algerian revolution, the troubles, the unrest in Algeria in the 1950s, would anybody describe that as a conflict between what was clearly a colonial power and the colonized people? Of course not, because the truth is it was not a conflict, as likewise is the case with Israel-Palestine. It is not a conflict. It is a colonial settler situation. And the people, the indigenous native people of the country in which the settler colony has been established have resisted it and continue to resist it. That is the truth of the situation. The term narratives is also not appropriate. Like conflict, it's not appropriate. It is not a narrative. That implies that somehow these are points of view, that, you know, you've got your story, I've got mine. It's not like that. The reality is, as I've said, it's a colonial enterprise, and the people at whose expense it was realized have rejected it. That's the truth of the situation. Now, how is the academic teaching of this subject, how is it dealt with this? Well, I would say very unsatisfactorily and very unfairly to date. The reason being that if you do not make clear the nature of what the issue is, you cannot actually teach it honestly. You find yourself having to conform to stereotypes and various invented ideas in which you must fit into a narrative which says that the establishment of the State of Israel in Palestine is something other than what it is. And hence, I go back to my original statement, which is that this is very much related to the Holocaust, to the persecution of Jews, for which Europe and Europeans are responsible, and for which the Palestinians have been asked to pay the price. Presenting it like that, first of all, tells the truth, and secondly, simplifies it. When you understand that you have a colonial situation here, and that the indigenous population resists it, as indigenous peoples have always resisted colonialism, then it becomes really very much simpler. However, I can really understand why this hasn't happened to date. The delicacy around the idea that a state set up in compensation for huge suffering, albeit in another part of the world, but there's a sensitivity around criticizing it, saying it shouldn't exist, and so on, is such that people feel they cannot tell the truth. And this has become so persuasive, so pervasive, that it is virtually impossible to get a decent education in this, I have to use the word conflict because that's the one that's generally been accepted. Now, I really, given the happenings of October 7th, which have changed all the assumptions that the world has been living on and working on, they've changed all those assumptions. In the wake of this huge event, it's very important to re-examine the presentation of this story, to search for the truth, and to recognize that what we have here is an old-fashioned settler colonialism masquerading as something else, partly biblical prophecy realization, partly recompense for the Holocaust, and all based on the false idea that Jews and Israel, Jews and Zionism are identical. They're not. And I think once this is understood, teaching, academic teaching, school teaching will become much simpler and more straightforward.
Thank you very much, Ghada. Okay, so I'm also delighted to introduce the next speaker, Professor Haim Breshith Zubner. Haim is a filmmaker, photographer, and a film studies scholar, retired from the University of East London, where he worked since 2002. He is now a professorial research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Haim's films include the widely shown BBC documentary State of Danger on the First Palestinian Intifada and London is Burning after the 2011 riots. He has published several books, including An Army Like No Other, How the Israel Defense Force Made a Nation, and Introducing the Holocaust with Stuart Hood. Just before I hand over to you, Haim, I'd just like to remind everyone, the audience, please, if you have any questions, please post them so that we can address them later. Thank you. Haim, over to you now.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this very large audience. I think following my dear friend Rada, I need to just add a few details because she's already answered the questions I think that you set for her and for us. Now, the first thing I want to say is personal. I'm the other half of Rada's story. Yeah, my parents were Holocaust survivors. Both of them survived Auschwitz, and they met in Italy after the war. And I was born in a refugee camp and came to Palestine as a baby in 1948. Around the time that Rada was ejected. So we are kind of like two sides of a very terrifying coin, the coin of the Nakba. If you accept that what was done in academia as well as in the media and in the public sphere over the last at least 75 years, as an act of, basically not allowing the truth out about Palestine and its Nakba, then we need to think about the reasons why this continues to happen so many years after 1948 and, of course, after the Second World War. And these reasons are important. First of all, I want to say a few things about settler colonialism and colonialism as a 19th century, mainly a 19th century. Modern colonialism is divided into different periods and into different types. Not all colonialists and not all colonial regimes are the same. Some of them are based on exploitation. Some of them are based on expulsion, and yet others are based on genocide. Genocide normally is selected when both exploitation and expulsion have been tried and failed. Now, for examples of exploitation in colonial regimes, we can think of Algeria, which Rada has mentioned, Namibia, and Congo. Now, of course, in Namibia and Congo, and to a degree also in Algeria, genocide has happened in a very severe manner. In terms of regimes that use expulsion, we can think of South Africa, where the blacks were expelled from, the countries that the part of the country that whites have seen as their own. North America, of course, Israel, no doubt, Australia, and so on. Genocide, of course, happened mainly in North America, definitely in Congo, Namibia, and Algeria, and some other countries. It's very interesting to note that the Bible has been used in some of those colonial regimes. The South Africans saw themselves as the select people, the people selected by God in the Bible. So did the North Americans, of course, the Israelis, and to some degree other regimes. But those three definitely put this right in the center of their being and looked at the indigenous population as no more than the animals that they actually hunted for food. I don't need to, for this audience, to go into the terrifying numbers that were killed as part of those three projects. They were really much larger than the Holocaust itself. So the fact that actually different colonial projects use the Bible and religion as a kind of land ownership certificate are not new and are not different in those. Anyone that presents a myth from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago as proof for the rights of the country is slightly off the mark. Yeah, I mean, this is nonsensical, of course. If you look at me, you realize that my DNA did not come from Palestine. We know that most European Jews are the result of the conversion of the Khazars in the 10th century, as was known for at least a century and a half. So I don't actually come from Palestine, and I have no right to live there unless and until the Palestinians want me around, and I accept that it's their country. So that's a very simple presentation of what people tell you is very complex. The fact that they always start, no, it's very complex. When people say to you it's very complex, you know that it isn't, that they don't want to talk about reality. They want to talk about myth. Now, I want to talk about the timeline. By the time that the Zionist colonization of Palestine starts, we already see the decline of all colonial regimes that started after the 16th century. And some of them even started in the 19th century, but rather earlier 19th century. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, colonialism is doomed. So Zionism is a very odd animal that doesn't live in the zoo very easily, this zoo of colonial regimes, because it started at the time that the other colonial regimes tended to end. The British Empire ended all its colonial affairs, or almost all of them. Remember Northern Ireland. By the time that the Israeli state was set up, India was divided by the British in 1947, at the same time that the UN divided Palestine for no good reason. And the way that it was done created the Nakba, of course. First, why did the West support Zionism even before the Holocaust? Because it did. Zionism is a creature of the West, and the West was not the nicest place for people who were termed as others to live it. Jews and others, for example, the Roma people, and a lot of Muslims that ended up in Europe before the 20th century suffered intense racism, as we well know. Zionism appears as a solution, a political solution to anti-Semitism. But it didn't resolve anti-Semitism, of course. I mean, the Holocaust is the best example of that fact. And what happened is that Theodor Herzl, a Western Jew from Vienna, sees the situation in Europe, especially in France, which he was very well aware of because he was working as a journalist at the time in Paris during the Dreyfus affair in the end of the 19th century, and thinks we need to resolve this. But other people also thought at the same time that this needs resolution. They were socialists. There was a very clear division in Jewish communities, especially in East Europe, between people who were socialists and wanted to resolve all the problems of society, and between people like Herzl that wanted to resolve only the situation of Jews by removing them to another country. 98% of Jews in the two big countries where they lived in Eastern Europe, Poland and Russia, supported the Bund. This is an incredible number. The Bund was the second largest party in Poland. The second largest party in Europe, in Poland, was a Jewish party. This is incredible and not understood by most people nowadays. The people who voted for the Bund were socialists. They believed that you resolve racism, like anti-Semitism, in the country that you live by changing it to a democratic socialist country where it is against the law and against society to actually exhibit or practice racism of any kind. This is what most Jews before the Second World War did. As we know, just to say, I said 98% of Jews supported the Bund, 2% supported Zionism. This was the strength of Zionism in the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. It was a tiny minority that supported Zionism, because even those in Western Europe that did not support socialism saw Zionism as a toxic movement that will bring anti-Semitism an easy solution for Jewish populations. They will just say, go to Palestine. What are you doing in England? What are you doing in France? What are you doing in Europe? Go to Palestine, because this is what Zionism has imported into the debate. Now, I want to say that actually Zionism was very welcome to the Russian Tsar or to the British Empire or to all the countries that did not really want Jews there. Remember that we are speaking in England, where England in the 13th century got rid of its whole Jewish population after the York massacre. So when Britain masquerades as it had never anything to do with anti-Semitism, this is what it is. It's a lie. Yeah. So all these regimes in Europe that were not really ever friendly towards Jews or towards the Roma or towards, of course, Muslims, as they are not now, were welcoming Zionism as a solution that will take the Jews off their hands and export them to another country. All of them knew very little about Palestine. They were not really interested in finding out. Neither was Herzl. He didn't know that it is already a country, a home to a whole nation, the Palestinians, who filled the country, and there was no space, in a sense, for another nation there, and nor was there a call for them. So the appearance of Zionism at the end of the 19th century, where there was a massive wave of attacks against Jews in Russia and in Poland, actually played into the hands of the anti-Semites. They could now say, you've got nothing to do here in Russia, in Poland, or in other countries. So this is why it was supported from the start by most European nations, and still is supported as a solution, because I don't think that Germans, for example, want to be reminded about their part in the Holocaust. Instead, what they do now is call people like Rada and me and Ilan, who couldn't be here today, and many others, anti-Semites, because we are actually supporting the rights of Palestinians as the indigenous population of Palestine. So you have now a situation that the Germans, who after all have some connection to the Holocaust, however small, are now speaking as if they are the arbiters of racism and anti-Semitism. They know about this more than I do, though, you know, my family was destroyed by them in the Holocaust. Now they call me an anti-Semite, or rather an anti-Semite. We are both sufferers of the Holocaust. Indirectly, we are both sufferers of the Holocaust. So Zionism has, from the start, lived a double life. Herzl, and please read his complete diary, and only the complete diary, because it was censored from every other form of his diaries in all languages. There's only one complete diary of Herzl in English, and it was published in 1956. So in there you can read everything that was to happen in the 50 years after he completed the diary. He is openly, but secretly, because the diary was not to be published and wasn't published for 50 years after he died, he openly presents ethnic cleansing as the solution for emptying Palestine of its indigenous population. To give you the pages, it's page 88 to page 100. All these pages are describing the different stages of getting rid of the population of Palestine so that Jews can live there without non-Jews. So on the one hand, he called it a colonial solution. He advocated opening a colonial bank and building colonies. All this happened, you know, colonies were built. They're still called colonies in Hebrew. Moshavot is colonies. Even the names have not been changed. The colonial bank was in London and was called the Colonial Bank. And then changed its name in 1948 to the National Bank of Israel. Yeah, but it was called the Colonial Bank because it was a colonial bank, and this was an effort of colonization. Now, even before 1948, most Palestinians were already losing their homes. In 1926, for example, 26 villages were ethnically cleansed. The British Army removed all those thousands of people from the Valley of Jezreel because their land was bought by the colonial regime of Zionism, and all of a sudden they who were there and the fathers and grandfathers before them for more than 1,000 years, now all of a sudden lost not just their homes, but their livelihood. They could make no living. There is a lot of work explaining, a lot of historical work explaining why Palestinians became a working class, or really, you know, a lumpen proletariat in Palestine, because the villages lost the land on which to make a living. So this has not started in 1948, but in 1948, 2/3 of the Palestinians, 750,000 people, it's a terrifying number, but of course, in Gaza already, 1.9 million people already lost their homes, and those homes do not exist anymore because the army has destroyed them, so that they cannot come back to them. So already in 1948, the ethnic cleansing and the genocide started. Almost 20,000 Palestinians were killed in the events that led to their leaving the country. This was not done by, please, can you go somewhere, but by the gun. So now what Palestine has become is, it is under the rule. Every inch of Palestine since 1967 is under the rule of the Israeli settler colonial state. As other settler colonial states, it is a racist enterprise. Without racism, you cannot do the things that they do. And so was the South African effort, so was the North American effort, so was the Algerian one. So were the others I mentioned before. Racism is a machinery, and racialization is the machinery of othering the indigenous population and making it possible psychologically for human beings to actually hate and kill and dispossess other human beings, because no longer are they considered human being. So about the opposition of the local population in Palestine, we can read back to the 19th century. They didn't wait for 1948. They understood what is happening and fought it, but remembered that they're fighting the strongest empire in history. And they are still fighting another empire, now the strongest one in history. First they fought Britain, and now they're fighting the whole West. I was going to say the US, but it's the whole West. It's the West against the rest. And Israel is the poster boy of the West and has been so since 1948. So the opposition to this colonial regime in Israel is not only just, is not only legal because it is made so actually in 1948 by the UN. Opposition to occupation of your country is legal, and even armed opposition is legal. So when people are calling Hamas a terror organization, let us just not forget that they called the IRA a terror organization, that they called the ANC a terror organization, that they called the FLN a terror organization. But all of these were organizations of opposition to a colonial regime. Indeed, the PLO itself was called a terror organization until it signed an agreement and became part of the machinery of dispossessing the Palestinians. So at the moment, the organizations in Gaza and to quite a degree also in the West Bank who are opposing Zionism are only doing what nations all over the world were doing. And if you are acquainted with the work of Fanon, then you know that there is no other way of freeing your country than using violence against the violent. Yeah, the violence of the liberators is not the violence of the colonizers. This is a very distinct thing that we need to point out, that there is a justified violence and there is a violence which is used to enslave and dispossess people in their own countries. So to end up, I want to connect those strands by saying that basically Israel has become very clearly an unviable society. Any society that, like some other societies, which I will not mention, is dealing with genocide and extermination of the population under control, are not viable, are not legal, are not moral, and are not even logical. And therefore, what Israel is now doing in Gaza is all those things. It's illegal, it's immoral, it is not logical, because there is no plan for what happens when the guns go quiet, if they ever do. The only plan is for extermination and genocide and ethnic cleansing. That is all we are hearing from Israel, from the top to the bottom, from the leadership to the people in the streets, to the social media, to the mainstream media. Everywhere in Israel, the word is empty Gaza and empty Palestine. And basically, Zionism has now matured. I'm an Israeli, I'm a Jew, I'm an anti-Zionist, and I'm saying to you that Israel is not a society which has a right to exist as a colonial regime. It has no right to live there as an apartheid system. The only way it could remain there as a society is if it was decolonized from top to bottom by working with the Palestinians to build a just society in the whole of Palestine under control of the population of people rather than a colonial regime. This seems to be very unlikely at the moment, and not just at the moment. Both Rada and myself have for years argued with Ilan and others for a one democratic state in the whole of Palestine. This seems to be a very far off dream at the moment, because I cannot imagine that the people of Gaza would like to live in the same entity, same political entity with those people who not only killed their families, but actually publicize this on social media as some kind of great achievement. So I think we are now seeing, after more than a century of Zionism, a maturation into a genocidal regime. No longer is there a possibility of lying to people about the real nature of Zionism. This was done for many decades, including in universities. So to sum up, I just want to say that it was possible in the past to frighten people of saying the truth. And in the past, I mean even this year, before the 7th of October, because of the use of the IHRA. I don't need to tell you about it. The use of legislation that saw Zionist Jews and Israelis mixed up in a way that Rada explained is a lie. You know, I am a Jew. I'm also an Israeli citizen, and I am anti-Zionist, and I will remain so. And the number of anti-Zionist Jews is growing by the day. But what I think we now have, which we didn't have before, is that Palestine has reached the South African moment. The South African moment is the moment when the whole of the world understood that apartheid is inhuman, illegal, and should be ended. This moment has now been reached in Palestine. Never before did we have billions of people all around the globe understanding all this they did not read our books. They did not study this in universities. They saw it on their telephones, and they understood that genocide is genocide, that ethnic cleansing is ethnic cleansing. You don't have to have a PhD to understand that. So we have the work of people from Patrick Wolf and onwards, including the important books that Ilan, Rada, Nur Masalha, and others have written about this history. And these are the books that I think now should be used everywhere in universities in the UK, where before I think people read mainly work of the colonizers. I think there's time now to actually support the end of the Zionist project to decolonize Palestine and to have a society that is actually a just society towards Jews, Arabs, who are, of course, mainly Muslim, but also Christian. Remember that before 1948, Palestine was a country of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And it was that for more than 1,000 years. So there is a history that we can relate to, a history that we can return to. Without Zionism, it is possible that all people of Palestine can live together. Those that don't accept equality, that believe in Zionism, in racism, and in apartheid, will have no place in a country like that, and in a just state in Palestine. But all the others, I think, will be able to live together if at all we can decolonize Palestine. Having decolonized most of the planet, I think the task for humanity, not just for the Israelis and Palestinians, but the task for humanity is to decolonize Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chaim. We will go now to questions from the audience, but I just wondered if Les, you had a question that you wanted to ask first.
Yes, well, I've read questions from the audience, and I'll just perhaps synthesize a couple of them into a question. And there was a question to distinguish between Jews and Zionism, and I think both the speakers have explained that well enough. But then the tricky question is, how have Jews been systematically conflated with Zionism as a political agenda, and perhaps within academia as well, thereby necessitating alternative academic approaches? What drives that conflation politically?
Do you want us to relate to it?
Yes.
Rada, do you want to go first?
I think Chaim would be a much better place to talk about this than me, but I will say this, that the conflation is entirely the responsibility of Israel. It's the responsibility of Zionism. It's because, again, going back to my own talk, that the project, the whole Israeli project, is so outrageous that it needed all the help it could get to validate itself. And one of the most powerful ways is, and which the whole idea is based, that Jews belong in that piece of land, and Jews are and that piece of land, the state, is the correct representative of the Jews of the world. That's the basic Zionist idea, and it's been pushed by Israel and its friends since long before 1948. So today, it's any obfuscation, any ambiguity about Jews and Israelis and Zionists should be laid at the door of the Zionists. They've created this for their own reasons, and it's a very important weapon that they use. And I think it's over to Haim to explain more.
Thanks. I will just continue because it's the same argument that we are both making. Israel had many reasons to become what I would call speaker of the Jewish dead after the Holocaust, even before 1948. One of them is an incredible reason. It was worth a lot of money. The Jews who were destroyed in the Holocaust are the only group of people of any Holocaust. There were many genocides. The last count is more than 70 genocides. And we're not talking about ancient times, we're talking about the modern period. So there were 70 genocidal attacks. No other group has been compensated by the genociders, but the Jews. Immediately, even before 1948, the Zionist organization started a campaign to place itself as the speaker for the Jewish dead. In other words, the inheritor of their rights and property, and mainly the psychological and symbolical inheritor of their suffering in the Holocaust. Of course, while the Holocaust was happening, Zionism didn't really care about those Jews, like my family, because they were the wrong Jews. You know, it's not Corbyn haters that invented the phrase "the wrong Jews." Zionists considered people in Europe, Jews in Europe, as those 98% I described before as the voters of the Bund, the Socialist Bund in the Eastern Europe. They considered them as lost. They were described as such by, someone who became the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. So they did not quite like them when they were alive, but once they were dead, they had some uses. Norman Finkelstein has written about the abuse of the dead Jews and their memory in the Holocaust, and so have I and many other people. Now, in order to argue that they are the inheritors, they had to be the speakers of all the Jews. And so the state that they built was termed a Jewish state. And this was the case since the Balfour Declaration, of course. And Britain played along with that. If you remember the Balfour Declaration, the Palestinians are not even mentioned there by any description. They're just called the local population, while the Jews everywhere are supposedly a nation. The Palestinians are not a nation. Of course, the opposite is true. The Jews are not a nation. The Jews are a minority in many places. They share a religion. They don't share ethnicity, as I've explained. They share some cultural features because most of the Jews before the Second World War didn't even speak the same language. So, Jews were not a nation in the way that we understand nations since the 19th century, but they became a nation in 1948, for sure, as part of the UN. Now, what I want to say about that is that the Jews of Israel presented themselves as the only proper Jews. Other Jews should actually come to Israel, join them, and if they are not willing to do that, at least to pay for building a Jewish home in Palestine. This is still the main attitude that they take towards the Jews outside of Israel. Now, what I deal with in my book about the IDF from 2020, An Army Like No Other, is the explanation how a group of people who were secular, those Jews that came to Palestine between 1881 and 1948 were secular. They mostly were secular Jews, and mostly they were socialists. Their socialism did not extend to allow a single Arab Palestinian into Jewish populations. For example, the kibbutzim, the colonies, etc. Arab Palestinians were not acceptable because there were no Jews. So this is a very strange form of socialism, which I would call national socialism, because this is what it was. Now, they have, over the 75 years that the country exists, the state exists, transformed their identity very interestingly. They replaced the deity, the Jewish God of the Bible, which is not a simple identity, but no time for talk about that. But they replaced the God with the state and with its strongest symbol, the IDF. At the same time that they did that, in other words, secularizing the Jewish God, they actually turned as a society more towards the Jewish religion that they also invented. The Jewish religion that they invented is the religion of Joshua, of taking over a country and killing everyone. And if you look at the book of Joshua, it included not just men, women, and children, like in Gaza, but also all the animals, and everything had to be burnt because it was unclean. So this type of nationalism is non-Jewish. Jews lived for 2,000 years outside of Palestine, totally pacifically. They did not live as a militarized minority in Europe or in the Arab world. And in the Arab world, they live with the something that was near equality. There was no anti-Semitism. There were no pogroms. There was no Holocaust. There was no hatred, organized hatred, socialized, politicized hatred towards Jews in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, I should say. This was only a Christian invention. So they transformed both their identity and their religion into Zionism. The religion that now is used to justify genocide in Gaza did not exist before 1948. This is a new iteration of Judaism, which is racist, which is murderous, which is colonial, which is immoral. It has no justification in the Jewish religion that people like my family and Jews before them held for 2,000 years all over the world. It doesn't exist in that religion. So by changing the nature of Judaism, not just in Israel, but also in the West. Look at the West. All the major Jewish communities in the West are supporting genocide. How is this possible, I ask you? The Jews who suffered so much from racism and from genocide in the 20th century are now supporting and actually enacting genocide. It's because Judaism itself has been taken over by this toxic colonialism called Zionism, and the deity, what is sacred, is no longer the Jewish God of the Bible, but the state and its main destructive machineries, like the IDF and others. So I think that's what happened. What happened is not only the Jews outside of Israel, not all of them, because look at what happens in the United States already. Most young Jews are now realizing this, and they are anti-Zionist, and they are against the genocide, and they support Palestine. So young Jews in the States got the message. They want to go back to a different Judaism, the Judaism that existed before Israel and Zionism, and will continue to exist, I'm sure, after the decolonization of Israel. So this is what happened, and not only did Jews buy into this toxic ideology, but actually the rest of the world, not the rest of the world, the West bought into it, because it's helping them to use Israel for their own devices. Now, this is a really odd dog of the West, because sometimes it wags, the tail wags the head here, like now. If, for example, Biden so much wants to stop what is happening in Gaza, he only needs to make a phone call. He doesn't even need to make a phone call. He just gives the order. No, the West is part of this. The West is feeding it. The West is financing it. The West is arming it. And this is also a sign of the decline of the West, not just the decline of Zionism into a murderous gang, but it's also a sign of the decline of the West.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that leads into another question, which was in the quick Q&A section, which was responding to a previous question. And the previous one was about the perpetrators that established the state of Israel controlling the dominant narrative and the world's resources. And then the response was that this contains an anti-Semitic slur, so the webinar organizers have a responsibility to remove the post. So I could ask the speakers, well, who were the perpetrators? I mean, this could be seen as an international Jewish conspiracy theory, right? Which is well known for a long time and has taken many forms, Jesus conspiracists. But if the perpetrators are the colonial or former colonial powers, then it takes on a different meaning. So is this an anti-Semitic slur or something else?
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, it's certainly an anti-Semitic trope, and really has no place in a discussion like this or any other discussion. The issue of who are the perpetrators is very important, and it's quite clear that the whole enterprise, the whole Israeli project, would never ever have got off the ground without Great Britain. It's clear that it was Britain that accepted the Zionist case for its own reasons, and quite mistakenly believed this kind of small group of fanatical believers in quotes, a return of Jews to Palestine, etc. The British, who were the colonizers in the area, and particularly in Palestine, were attracted to the idea that there could be a colony set up in Palestine, regarded at the time as strategically very important for the Suez Canal and for other connections. They thought that it was something that would serve their interests if they set up or helped set up this colony, and in the belief, which turned out to be very mistaken, in the belief that this colony would be gratefully agree and accept to further the strategy and ideas and desires, plans of Britain. So that's really the thing which is crucial to this project. Now, if you really then want to talk about the on the ground, as it were, perpetrators, you have to go to Eastern Europe, where you had a bunch of people who believed in this thesis of Zionism and who were a minority of Jews, and other Jews didn't agree with it. They were not interested. Haim has talked about the Bund. So most Jews belonged to that. They did not belong to this narrow, this group of narrow nationalists. And so really the whole thing would never have got anywhere had it not been for Britain. So really what we're looking at is a bunch of people in a, if you like, a cult, Zionism as a cult, in which like all cults, you know, is a bunch of odd people who then have their moment in history and disappear. And that's what would have happened had it not been for Britain with these imperialist ideas that it needed, it could use a loyal colony. As one of the people, the officials, senior officials in Palestine called it, our own, quote, loyal little Ulster in Palestine. So that I think was the situation.
I also believe that without the Holocaust, and Rada said this before, without the Holocaust, this project could not take part, because most Jews were indeed not Zionists. And Hitler did a great service to Zionism by killing all its opposition within the Jewish communities of Europe. The communities of Europe were opponents of Zionism. They did not contribute to Zionism very much in terms of sending people. So by destroying the anti-Zionist Jews, what was left is the shame and guilt for the destruction in Europe and elsewhere, and the Jewish colony that now became not just a colony of Britain, because in quick succession, France became the replacement of Britain as the armament supplier and financier of Zionism. And not only that, it also gave Israel the necessary science to build the nuclear devices that Israel has between 200 and 300 of. And of course, since 1967, the main empire then in power, the United States, became the replacement for Britain and France by supporting Israel as its main extension in the Middle East. You can think of it as the 51st state. But as opposed to the other 50 states, it has rights that they don't have. For example, of all the nations in the world, the aid given to the poor part of the world population by the United States is smaller than that given to Israel alone. Now, of course, what this gang is rather called it, this cult that controlled Palestine, wanted to argue is that it supplies Jews with a safe haven from anti-Semitism and racism in the world. Now, is Israel a safe place for Jews? I ask you. Is Israel instead the only place where Jews are never safe because they are colonialists with a extermination drive, as we can see now in Gaza and the rest of Palestine? They have created the only place currently where Jews are not safe ever and cannot be safe as long as they are colonialists. So there are a lot of misunderstandings which are planned in, are designed misunderstandings in the West about Israel. Israel is supposedly need in support because it is defending Jews. It is not defending Jews. It is not defending Jews in Israel. It is not defending Jews elsewhere. It is actually bringing about a wave of anti-Semitism that didn't exist before in places where it was not alive. For example, many Muslims are now hostile to Jews in not just in Palestine because they misunderstand and confuse or accept the confusion between the conflation between Jews and Zionists. We should not ever allow that conflation to rule the public arena, yet it does. And the IHRA is responsible for this, and the countries like Britain and France and the United States and Canada and Australia, those countries and most of Europe that accepted the IHRA definition are doing the conflation between Jews, Zionists, and Israelis, and that conflation is only helping Israel. It is not helping anybody else, and it's not helping Jews because it puts them in the line of fire. If you think that all the Jews anywhere are supporting Israel, you are committing a great mistake and a great misunderstanding. And most Jews now realize that, and some of them are saying it. They're saying it very clearly, not in my name. I am not a Zionist. I don't support this genocide. Count me out. I oppose what is happening. So I just wish that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer were listening to the great number of Jews who are now telling them that they are not supporting genocide, but they are only listening to their dog in the Middle East.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I'll try to combine two that were in the chat. They were both about schools. We didn't have any questions about academia. There was a question from a school governor about how these issues could be introduced and handled in secondary schools. And then there was a related question saying the conflict is extremely complex, meaning socially here, I think it means, because it cannot be discussed without offending, supposedly, both Muslims and Jews. How do we circumnavigate the education system for young people where the teachers themselves have refused to tell the truth or have refused even to mention Palestine as being colonized? And I add my own comment about the education campaign called Solutions Not Sides, which has been successfully running events in many secondary schools and promotes the idea of equivalence, conflict between two sides, which, the dominant narrative, which was in the publicity for this event. So you could comment on those issues and perhaps your response to Solutions Not Sides, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, actually, I was part of a group not long ago which was looking at teaching textbooks on the Middle East for schools, for secondary schools. And the reason for looking at them was that it became clear that many of the main texts that are being used by schools are not honest about what's going on in Israel-Palestine. And it is very important to, first of all, in answer to the person who asks, how can we teach this subject? Well, first of all, you need to make sure that the textbooks you're using are not pushing a Zionist line. And that's not easy. It's not something that will stand up and tell you that it is. So you have to actually look at it properly, and you have to be clear that to the best of your ability, that what you're providing as textbooks are neutral, in that sense. That's the first. As for Solutions Not Sides, oh yes, sorry, let me just go on about the teaching. Now, so that's the use of textbooks. Now, that needs to be adopted also by teachers who need to present a neutral case which spells out the historical facts. It's not required in this situation, of all situations, because of the censorship, because of the monitoring that's going on by Israel supporters. It's really very important to remain neutral, tell the facts as they occur historically, and without passing opinions and so on. So it's close. I know this is very hard, but to try to do that as well as you can would be my advice. And teachers should not be intimidated. That is a fundamental principle of this whole arena. Must not be intimidated to tell the truth. Now, having said that, Solutions Not Sides is a very pernicious organization about which I do know something, that is there to whitewash Israel, as usual. As usual, there are so many of these initiatives masquerading as peace-loving, conciliatory, these sorts of descriptions, but which are in reality in the business of presenting Israel in a positive light. And one has to be extremely watchful in the way that I've talked about teaching this history in a neutral way. You have to be very watchful about organizations which are presenting themselves in this way. And you have to, if in doubt, exclude them. That's my advice.
I also think, I totally agree with what Rada said about Solution Not Sides. This is their method and this is their madness. However, the main problem is not teaching proper history in Britain, or for that matter, in other European countries or in the United States. People don't know their own history. First of all, let's remind all of you, all of us, that Britain is not only responsible for the woes of Palestine and for the colonization of Palestine and for Zionism, but it's responsible, together with France and the United States, for a Middle East, an Arab Middle East, which is a terrible invention of colonialism. They have created, if we talk about France, Syria and Lebanon, and the problems thereby, because they have fashioned the unequal constitution of Lebanon, for example, a constitution that, and as long as it lives, Lebanon cannot live. They have controlled Egypt. They've controlled what is now Jordan. They controlled Iraq. They controlled the Gulf. They had, a hand in removing the elected democratic government in Iran in 1953, together with the Americans. They have, together with France, controlled the whole region, North Africa and the Middle East, for such a long time. It was never properly decolonized. It was never properly democratized, as we remember from 2010-11, what is called the Arab Spring, mistakenly, but the intifada of all the Arab peoples. So the history holds the key to understanding what is happening now, but that history is not taught responsibly and openly and truthfully. When that history will be taught well, and the responsibility, especially of the British Empire, because we are the result of it as well here. When all those things, including, of course, India and Cyprus and everywhere, where the British have sown division and death and destruction. When this is taught openly and truthfully, then Palestine will also be understood. So this is not a problem just to do with Palestine. And the Tories have been very emphatic about teaching the positive sides of the British Empire. The positive sides of the British Empire are not known to me personally, and therefore I am not able to teach them. But I just wonder what children are now exposed to in those history classes about the British Empire. And let's be clear, the Labour Party has not been better about that. The Labour Party, of course, was in power where Palestine was handed to Zionism in 1948, and did not greatly disagree with the policies of Churchill before it. So all parts of the British society should actually be exposed to history, probably for the first time. History is not what this or that king did, and who was the son or daughter of the other king. This is not history. History is the history of peoples, and that we are not taught in schools.
Thank you very much, Haim and Ghada, for your response to that last question. I'm afraid we've gone over time now, but we could, I'm sure we could have continued the conversation for much longer. First of all, a big thank you, Haim and Ghada, for being with us today. That was a very, very interesting and an insightful discussion. To the audience members, also thank you for coming along. Thank you for supporting us. A recording of today will be made available and will be sent around. So thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا.